Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Paranet Continuum. My guest tonight is a journalist from the Los Angeles area. He's published 2 books on the shadowy world of mind control and the CIA. His latest book is Virtual Government, CIA Mind Control Operations in America. It's my pleasure to welcome tonight to the program Alex Constantine. And with that, good evening, Alex, and welcome to the program.
Well, how do you do? It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you for being there. I've read this book, not completely cover to cover, but this is a very, very fascinating work.
Yeah, you didn't know it existed until 2 days ago.
I know. It's incredible. I'm supposed to know these things. But anyway, before we get into this, kind of give us just kind of a condensation of what this book is about.
Well, the idea of the book was to expose as many CIA mind control fronts as possible between 2 covers. At least that was my intention when I set out. What I found is that I had a lot of explaining to do because the American public in general is not real up to date on the interactions of fascist governments around the world and how they interact and how they influence what happens in the United States. So I did something called a preamble in the beginning to sort of run all that down and explain how the foundation got here for mind-influencing technology and so forth.
Okay.
And then I get into mass mind control. So the first chapter is about the media, because back in 1947, Allen Dulles conceived something called Operation Mockingbird, which was conceived specifically as a mass mind control operation. And the CIA at that point begins to take over the media, co-opting national publications and regional newspapers and the like. They got into the works of major newspapers around the country, and by the mid-'70s, you find, according to the Church Committee, that there were at least 600 to 800 reporters being paid by the CIA working in the American media. So then I move on from there to individual mind control experiments on children, CIA mind control operations, because the experimentation ends about 1963, and MKUltra, as it was known, becomes operational, and we've been living with it ever since.
Okay, well, that's all very, very interesting. During this segment, I want to kind of explore, first of all, personally, how did you get involved in this kind of research? Because I know that your forte is reporting, right?
Yes, it is.
How did you get involved in this?
Well, at the time, now, if we go back about 10 years, I was doing television and movie reviews, that sort of thing, for an alternative paper here in L.A. Called the L.A. Weekly. And I was doing some spot work here and there in the press, and I went up to San Francisco to cover a murder trial because I had begun in Ohio working on hard crime cases, and that's really where my heart lay.
Uh-huh.
So I attended a trial of a homeless person who was murdered up there by the name of John Doe 60, at least. That's how he's referred to in the coroner's files. I don't think he's ever been identified, but he was picked up one night by 2 Satanists in San Francisco, and they drugged him and they chained him down. They proceeded to carve on his body, and they ate parts of his body and so forth. And I grabbed the key witness in this case because I was so concerned and a little bit worked up over this, about the gruesomeness of this murder.
Uh-huh.
So I spent 3 days interrogating the main witness in the case, and I discovered that these 2 characters had ties to some wealthy people in the San Francisco area. And also there was evidence of links to the CIA and the defense establishment up in San Francisco. So my head, I came away from that case with a lot of questions, and I guess I've been answering those questions ever since.
So that's how basically you got involved in this research.
Yes. That led me into mind control, and you may have heard of Mae Brussel.
Yes.
She was possibly the country's best conspiracy researcher. She studied fascism beginning immediately after the assassination of John Kennedy, and she had a program up in Monterey, California, and she died in 1988 of a very fast-working cancer. And at that point, I went to speak to the producer because I had information on Satanism, which was a subject she was just getting into. And in the United States, satanic cults very often are set up as mind control fronts or cutouts for the CIA, and they perform various functions from drug dealing to assassinations. So I began to hammer away on that point I was on this radio program that began shortly after Mae Brussel died. So I've been in it journalistically ever since.
Okay. Now, Alex, during the next 2 hours tonight, we're going to cover a lot of this material, a lot of the territory. Right. The thing I want to do is I want to kind of take this in stages. I think it's very important to kind of build this from the beginning. Where did you find in your research, where did all of this start, or where did it have its roots?
Well, let's see. We can. That's a very good question. I mean, I consider myself not a conspiracy researcher, but a researcher of fascism after World War II. So, where does this begin? Well, if you go back to Nazi Germany, you'll find mass mind control, you'll find experimentation, crude experimentation with drug and hypnosis and so forth. But mind control is just a part of the package. If we back up to the 1920s then, we find fascism emerging in the United States and in Germany and in Italy and other countries around the world as a response to communism, because the people in power feared that they would lose their wealth and privilege if communism took hold. So fascism was born as a response to communism. You may remember that World War I was called off because the Germans had to go back home and put down a German uprising. And that's sort of the point where fascism begins in the 20th century. So that's a subject I cover, and mind control is just a part of the package. So if your question is how did I become, or where does mind control begin? Well, in the United States, I think the beginning is the National Security Act of 1947, and the decision of the CIA to create what they call the Manchurian Candidate, which was something like a zombie that can have its memories wiped out, and therefore they can set it to do any operation they desire, pull off the perfect crime.
Okay. Anyway, we're going to be talking again, as I mentioned earlier, about this book, Virtual Government, the CIA Mind Control Operations in America. And while we're getting the guests back on the line, I want to mention that a lot of this stuff kind of butts up to the stuff that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks concerning, for example, Project Silverbug, concerning the so-called Nazi research into flying discs, and, of course, some of the stuff that happened when we brought the Nazi scientists and doctors over here from Germany under Operation Paperclip. Have we got Alex back? Okay. Okay, Alex, are you there?
Yes, I'm
Great,
here.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's pick up where we left off during the first segment. Let's start talking about the this thing that was going on in Nazi Germany, or how it led up to get over here.
Well, we had it going actually since the 1920s. The U.S. military had played around with hypnosis as a form of mind control. They were hoping to develop it as a covert weapon of war, and they had some success with it. And in the technology field too, if you go back to the 1920s, according to an issue of Popular Mechanics that I have here, there was a doctor by the name of Casimili who had some success with transmitting noises to the human brain by setting up a system of oscillators and transmitters and so forth, looking for the brain's frequency. And he managed to cause clicking sounds in the auditory tracts of some of his subjects. So that's where you find some experimentation, various ends of this field up to the present time. And it really goes back a lot farther than the creation of MKUltra.
What was the purpose or the goal that these guys were trying to accomplish by being able to do this?
Well, the foremost item on the agenda of MKUltra, like I said, was the creation of a Manchurian Candidate. And this was an assassin who could be programmed to go out into the field and pull off the assassination, receive a trigger that would entirely wipe out his memory. And like I said, that's the perfect crime. You can, once you do that, you can get away with just about anything. And I think I mentioned earlier that they perfected an electronic method called electronic dissolution of memory that was perfected by 1960. And then, of course, the first so-called alien abduction takes place. And that's because once they had that capability of wiping out the memory, they could do pretty much with experimental subjects anything that they wanted. And, of course, they could use hypnosis and various other means in the present, including virtual reality, to replace lost memories with memories that the CIA desires to leave the subject with. And, of course, then the subjects go around talking about aliens. Well, in the 60s, this was done with hypnosis. And they had other electronic processes to facilitate that process.
Wow. Now, before we get into this, I want to say one thing. I've myself reading your book today. I can't tell you how many times I've fallen out of my chair.
You don't know how many times you've heard this.
Because I'll tell you why. And this is what I want to cover, basically, this is really, I think it's very bizarre, but I think it's very significant. The people that, for example, the audience that listens to this program mostly are interested in, matters of the paranormal, UFOs, and that type of thing. The one thing that I have found reading your book is that there is an uncanny connection between a lot of the names of the people that are the movers and shakers, if you will, of the UFO movement over the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah, that's true.
And these people pop up in your research as people that have been engineering this mind control scenario and other nasty and nefarious things.
You'll find that many of the spokesmen who are out there driving in that alien cover story have a dual role because they're either involved in advanced technology or very deeply involved in the intelligence field. And as far as I'm concerned, there is no innocence in the intelligence field.
I agree.
So you have these people beating the drum. Every time you turn on the television, it's aliens. And you tell me how many other classified programs in the Pentagon you can find on television every time you turn the damn thing on.
I know what you mean.
They want us to believe this. This is the mass mind control I was talking about in the beginning. And if you go back and look at the minutes of the Robertson Committee, which was the first committee set up by Dr. Robertson, who was a CIA operative, those minutes read a lot more like how do we cover this entire thing up than how do we deal with the problem of UFOs, because there was no problem, and we could run down the history of the UFOs if you want to. It's all out there.
Okay, I want to do that because, again, this I think is very significant. Because a lot of people today, and I mean, over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about this on the program. We've been talking about, number one, the declassification of the Project Silverbug document, for one thing. I'm sure you probably know about that.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Well, 1955, ATIC, which was Wright-Patterson out there, was involved in the creation of a disk that was taken, I believe, from Nazi technology.
Yes.
That could attain, according to this document, it could attain a speed of 2,300 miles an hour.
Yeah, they could do about 5 times the speed of sound in the early 50s.
Yeah, and at an altitude of 70,000 feet.
Yeah, there was a reporting about this time down in Mexico where a whole collection of discs spelled out the word Pepsi in the sky.
Yeah, I read that too. And
yes.
The other thing that I think that a lot of people will be shocked to hear is, what are Foo Fighters?
Well, let's start right there then.
Okay.
You had a German official who most people have never heard of. His name was Hans Kammler. And he and some of his staff had built Auschwitz, and of course Auschwitz was used for medical experimentation. But Hans Kammler had set up operations during World War II in Poland, and he was overseen by Albert Speer, who of course survived World War II and went on to become fabulously wealthy. Well, among the advanced technology projects that they were working on was something called the Foo Fighter, which was a television controlled, that is TV waves, controlled flight vehicle that was not manned. It was strictly remote controlled. It had a television camera outfitted on the front, and inside of it there was a generator that could knock out airplane ignition systems. So if this thing came flying within 100 yards, bombers heading for Berlin, say, their ignitions would be knocked out and they would crash. So what is the one thing you keep hearing about UFOs to the present day? When they get over a house or they get over a car, they knock out the ignition. So they still have that capability. Now, what happened is at the end of World War II, there's chaos because the Russians are advancing, the British and the Americans are advancing. It's pretty much everybody's grabbing what they can from the Nazis. Now, the British went to the Harz Mountains, and they found a base there that was built underground where these Foo Fighters were being made. They confiscated the plans and some of the prototypes. They take it back to England, And they didn't give it to the United States because the United States had the atomic secret and England wanted it. So they had to have something that they could barter for the atomic bomb. So they went to work on these Foo Fighters. They put the thing in a wind tunnel, and they played around with various configurations. And the first thing that they started with was a basic aerodynamic wing design. Then they brought the wings back pretty much to the delta shape. As a matter of fact, there's a Paperclip scientist who is credited with creating the delta wing. His name is Alexander Lippisch.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt right there, Alex.
Yes.
Hold that thought, because when we come back, we'll continue that. My guest tonight is very interesting, Alex Constantine. His book is Virtual Government, CIA Mind Control Operations in America. And, of course, this book is published by Feral House and is available in all bookstores. And I encourage you to pick up a copy. And, of course, one thing I want to mention, too, before I go back to Alex, is that his previous book is called Psychic Dictatorship in the USA, and it was kind of a precursor to the virtual government, and was also quite interesting as well. Now, Alex, when we went to break, we were talking about the Foo Fighters and what was going on over there. Go ahead and continue with that.
Right. First of all, as regards Psychic Dictatorship, I think it's interesting that the very first copy was ordered by Chris Carter, the producer of the X-Files.
Are you serious?
Yes. And you'll see the similarities between the two, which is why if you look at the cover of Virtual Government, I took his lettering. That's the X-Files lettering.
Right, okay. Sure.
So we're just saying hello to each other. In fact, Mulder goes around sometimes quoting from Psychic Dictatorship. So.
Really? That's interesting.
So if you like the X-Files, you'll like Psychic Dictatorship.
Okay, that's good.
That's I wanted to get that out of the way. Now, what was the question again?
Okay, we were talking about the Foo Fighters. Now,
yeah, okay.
The reason I want to say this is because, I myself was not aware, and according to what you found, our government knew what these were.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you'll find, if you go back and read the books in Operation Paperclip, you'll find the personnel who rounded up the Nazis and brought their technology back to the United States became very highly placed. That means lieutenants who were involved in finding the Nazis and their science ended up running the National Security Agency and various government functions of that sort. But to return to to England, where the first tests were conducted, they brought back the Foo Fighter. They played around with the Delta wing in the air tunnel, and what they found is that as they brought the wings back, they could increase velocity of the vehicle. So one of their scientists hit on the idea of wrapping the wings all the way around so that they had a saucer shape, and they tried it again, and they were happy with the results that they had, but they still weren't good enough. Now, if you look at, and I'll explain why, if you look at a standard airfoil configuration, if you remember from your high school science, there's about 1 inch of drag on the wing that's created by friction of air that builds up around the wing.
Right.
So you have this inch of drag that's slowing the whole vehicle down. Well, in a conventional jet design, you have suction in the front of the vehicle, and it's blasted out the back.
Okay.
So one of their scientists hit on the idea, what instead of for intake, what if we modify the suction design so that we put little pinholes all over the craft. The air is sucked in from all over to eliminate the drag on the vehicle, and then blast it out, say out the back or even out the front or out the bottom. So they tried that, and they had amazing results with it.
Wow.
So at this point, now this is 2 years after World War II, about 1947, they call up Rockefeller. Now, if you look at the biographies of Lawrence Rockefeller, you'll find out that this man was obsessed with airplanes. His funding started McDonnell Douglas. He owned pieces of 15 different aerospace companies, and these have become major corporations. And,
of course, we know, too, according to what you've got in here, and, of course, we know this as well, that Lawrence Rockefeller is a major benefactor of some of these kooky UFO...
In fact, almost all of them.
Right, okay.
He's paying money to these so-called experts on the alien invasion who are out there beating that drum to drive it into our heads, and at the same time, as I mentioned, they're working on the same technology, which is why all these guys have backgrounds in advanced design for the Pentagon, worked on classified projects and so forth. Even Ed Dames, who was working with what he called boxes in the sky that can peer through buildings. This is classified technology, and we'll get into this in a little bit.
Okay. Now,
so Lawrence Rockefeller flies over there and takes a tour of their facilities, takes a look at the Nazi projects, and sees this saucer and just about flips, right? So he sets up a secret base up in the wilderness in Canada, and that's why the very first overflights of UFOs are in Seattle or in the Washington area.
Right.
And who's there at the time to find these things when they crash? People like Clay Shaw.
Now,
right?
yeah.
Involved with the Kennedy assassination.
Now, Clay Shaw, as some people may or may not know, Clay Shaw was one of the fellows that he was actually, I think, the only person that was ever indicted or brought to charges concerning the Kennedy assassination.
He is the antagonist in Oliver Stone's JFK.
Okay.
And there were two scientists from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base who were on the outside of this whole project. They went up to investigate, and on the way back, the gas line clogged, and their airplane blew up. And according to the investigation, not according to me, but according to the investigators of that crash, it was sabotage.
Now, this is the Maury Island incident.
I believe so, yes.
You know, this is another thing that's interesting. The fellow, Fred Lee Chrisman?
Fred Lee Chrisman was another who was associated with Clay Shaw.
He was the guy that was in the boat with the one that recovered the material that came out of the UFO that was hovering over the water there.
Well, the interesting thing about both these characters is that they were involved in rounding up the Nazi prototypes and plans.
And as you mentioned, too, Chrisman was also involved in security work or handling security work for the aerospace firms.
Exactly.
This is just totally bizarre.
It's bizarre, but what you have to go back and cut through all the disinformation that the government has put out there. Now, I know now we're talking mind control now because that is the crux of the matter here. And, you know, to take some of the subjects that are covered on your program, those subjects happen to cover various categories of mind control experimentation.
Okay.
Let me give you an example.
Sure.
Down in Florida, there's an entire high school that has seen this ghostly marching band, you know, just marching up and down the halls. They could even hear the music.
Okay.
Now, this is the entire high school. This isn't one student.
Right.
The vice principal opens up a set of bay windows on the second floor, and a big ball of light comes floating through the window.
Okay.
Well, that wasn't an angel, right? That was a ball of plasma. If you've ever seen those globes, you touch them and the plasma goes to where your finger is on the globe.
Right.
That's the very same thing. But the Pentagon has some classified technology. Some of it's a little more advanced than what you're aware of. Some of it is very highly advanced and is some 30 or 40 years ahead of the most sophisticated technology that you're aware of.
Okay. Alex, hold that right there. But, you know, this is incredible stuff that you've dug up here, Alex. And, you know, I think, you know, one of the things that I know some of the people out there in the audience are probably sharply divided. Some believe that, you know, that there's aliens. I'm not really so sure that there are. But, you know, I say this, that, you know, there's precedence. There's actually data to prove what you're saying in the form of documentation and that type of thing. But what you were mentioning earlier about, you know, the Robertson panel and all of that, I had the rare privilege of having access to Edward Ruppelt's private papers for some time. And one of the things that we discovered was that he was talking about the NSA clear back in, you know, in the early 50s, before anybody even knew what the NSA was. And the thing that I found really interesting, and I've talked about this before, is that Ruppelt was told by an intelligence agent that the Washington National sightings that occurred in July of '52 were going to happen. Do you have a comment about that?
Now, you're talking 1952. At this time, Newsweek was running pictures of flying saucers that the military had developed.
Right.
I have a copy of Newsweek from 1950 with a photograph. So they hadn't arrived at the cover story at this time. And after the Washington overflight, the general came out, said pretty much it's classified business and it's none of your business.
Right. Now, let me ask you this. As a researcher yourself and, you know, not necessarily interested so much in the UFO phenomena, but I think that there's probably a strong possibility that somewhere in all of this foray is Roswell.
Yes, Roswell fits in here.
In what way?
Well, it's pretty much worked up as a propaganda coup. In fact, the last book, well-known book on Roswell. It was written by a man named Philip Corso,
Right.
who has a pretty incredible history of interaction not only with the intelligence community, but with neo-Nazi groups in the United States. Now, he belonged to a secret society in New York called the Shikshinny Knights of Malta. There's pretty much patterned after the military order that serves the Vatican. Now, the Shikshinny Knights of Malta was run by a man by the name of General Charles Willoughby, who was the head of MacArthur's intelligence in Korea. And Willoughby's name wasn't Willoughby, it was Wiedenbach, and he was an SS officer who was brought over here from Nazi Germany and became MacArthur's chief of intelligence.
That's incredible.
Now, it was Willoughby's disinformation to United States newspapers, especially the New York Times, that dragged us into the Korean War. And it's no different than the Vietnam War. The head of the Plans Division during the Vietnam War was a man by the name of Kramer, Fritz Kramer, another German who was brought over here and was the head of plans during the Vietnam War.
Do you think that anything happened in the desert in July of 47, like perhaps maybe one of these experimental craft with human beings aboard? Is that a possibility?
It's a possibility. I have several, I can break it down to several different variations. All I can say is that at this point, all you can do is explain it theoretically. But foremost, I look at it as a propaganda effort to explain these UFOs because they're out there. Everybody's seeing them. So
the reason that they'd want to explain the UFOs is to conceal their actual research. Actually, people were seeing things.
Yes.
But they're using these cover stories to make people turn off the subject, basically.
You have phases of development. You have the early experimental phase before the cover story, and then they're explaining it as classified stuff. The public doesn't have to know about this. Just mind your own business. And then the Robertson Committee comes along, and about this time that they create the alien cover story, and suddenly the motion picture industry is pumping out these alien movies. Now the thing is, they're out there. They're not concealed. They're concealed in plain sight. So somehow you have to explain them. Now
let me ask you this. How does the occult figure into this? Because I know that, again...
Jump.
How does the occult figure into this?
Okay, let's back up now. We've got MKUltra in the 1950s, and as I mentioned, CIA mind control becomes operational in the mid-60s.
Okay.
And there's also an important transition that takes place about this time. Just to give you an example, there was a man by the name of Jim Jones who was working for the CIA way back in the early 60s.
This is the People Temple guy, right?
People's Temple guy.
Right.
Well, the CIA gives him the results of their experimentation in 120 different sub-projects and tells Jim Jones, we want you to take this out and play with it in the field. See what you can do with it. Right?
Okay.
So he takes all this information. He spends a year down in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, with Joseph Mengele before he even begins his People's Temple.
Mengele?
Yes.
Jim Jones with Mengele?
Yeah, with Mengele. They both arrive there at the same time and leave at the same time.
Interesting. Okay, continue.
Lived in the same area. So what I'm saying is that this isn't proven, but there's strong evidence to suggest this.
Okay.
And I probably should have made that clarification.
Well, that's fine. Go ahead.
So then, and then you get to French Guiana, where you have the People's Temple moved to a concentration camp. Basically, People's Temple was comprised of mental patients who were taken out of, up in Sausalito, they were taken out of a mental institution by order of Governor Reagan, who wants to close down the mental institution and put those people on the street. And that's where they are today, by the way, here in California. Now, many of those people. So these mental patients are told, you can be free of the hospital, and we'll even give you a free house because guess what? Jim Jones is the housing authority in San Francisco. So we'll give you a free house if you join the People's Temple.
Oh, boy.
These people jump at the chance. The entire mental institution is closed down, and all the patients now are followers of Jim Jones.
And the rest is history.
Yeah, and the rest is history, but there's a lot of this history that isn't well known.
Okay.
For one thing, that concentration camp in French Guiana was sitting on land leased by an attorney for I.G. Farben, better known as the Auschwitz people, because they owned Auschwitz and the rubber plant behind it. and one of the supervisors in that rubber plant is now the Pope. So you find very interesting connections in all of this, and everywhere you look, as you connect these dots, you find old guard Nazis.
You said the Pope, as in the Catholic Pope?
Yes, his name is Karol Wojtyla. He's now the Pope.
Oh, boy.
If you remember, during the Vatican banking scandal, when $11–12 million disappeared, he called in 4 people to investigate the theft of those funds, and one of them was a Nazi banker during World War II.
Okay, Alex, we've got to go to another break. When we come back, we're going to wrap up the first hour. I'll get a closing comment for you on that.
I'd like to answer your question.
Okay, well, good. We're in the last stretch of the first hour with my guest, Alex Constantine. The book is Virtual Government. Alex was going to answer my question when we come back from this break, so go ahead, Alex.
Right. Now, when those people at Jonestown died, we go back to Albert Speer, because he crops up again all of a sudden. And he tells reporters that Odessa is taking over the United States. Odessa is the organization of retired SS officers. So now you have the influence of Nazi Germany in the United States, because all those Nazis were brought over. According to the Washington Post, a total of 5,000 Nazis and East European Quislings arrived in the United States as a result of that migration. So we have MKUltra, which includes German scientists and American fascists who are in the psychiatric community involved in mind control experimentation. And then around 1963, people start to wake up that the CIA is doing these things. So now the CIA has a difficult problem, and you can almost understand the problem that they had. If they stay on campus where most of these experiments were being conducted, sooner or later they'd be flushed out by the press. There were even congressmen asking questions. So what was the solution? The solution was to set up religious organizations and co-opt existing mind control cults, right? Some of them already being with a strong influence of Nazi Germany involved, and use the followers in those cults as mind control subjects. And very often at the ends of these operations, they end up, quote, suiciding again and again and again.
And so that's kind of where we get the connection to the occult.
Yes, absolutely. Now, there were 2 members in Rancho Santa Fe, just as an example, that were part of this UFO cult.
Heaven's Gate?
Yeah, who were associated with Jim Jones when he was up in San Francisco. That was Bo and Peep.
Right.
You may remember them.
Yes, yes.
In San Francisco, they're pretty well, people recall them.
Okay, that's going to wrap it up for us for this first hour, Alex. We'll have to cut it off there, but... decided to bring Alex back and continue our discussion into mind control and some of that stuff. But tonight we're going to kind of focus on some of the Nazi involvement and the subsequent intelligence community involvement in the saucer phenomena. And there's a lot of data coming out that indicates that the government had the capability and did have a saucer that flew as early as maybe the late 30s or early 1940s, and we're going to talk about that. Alex is a journalist from the Los Angeles area. He has published 2 books on the shadowy world of mind control and the CIA. His latest book is Virtual Government, CIA Mind Control Operations in America. And it's my pleasure to welcome to the program Alex Constantine. Good evening, Alex.
It's my pleasure to be here. I just want to let everybody know that this was a spur-of-the-moment thing. I didn't know that I was going to be on the program until just a few minutes before. So it's going to be a little bit off the cuff. I wrote the book 3 years ago, but I'll do the best I can.
Well, that's okay. No, we're talking about the one I just introduced about was the Virtual Government, the one you just published. But we're going to be talking a little bit, too, about your previous book, the one you just mentioned. The Psychic Dictatorship in the USA.
Yeah, it's been a few years since I read that myself, but
Well, I reread it. Just finished rereading it. It's very, very interesting.
Well, you may know it better than I do, but I'll give it a try.
Well, that's okay, Alex. Everything will be fine. Tonight I want to kind of focus on, because you've done a considerable amount of research, and as we mentioned last week, I was alarmed at some of the names that popped up in your research.
Right.
Into, some of the more, the more terrestrial-based, intrigue, if you will, the intelligentsia, whatever. But, some of the names that you came up with in your research are names that are very well known in the UFO community. Like, for example, Samford, General Samford, and, such notable people as Hillenkotter, Roscoe Hillenkotter.
Right.
And, the thing that I find very, very interesting, at least in the research that I've been doing, and we've been talking about this about a month and a half, 2 months ago, we had a fellow on who has been working the Nazi angle to the UFO business, and we've been talking about the idea that according to Project Silverbug, this document that was released last year by the government, in 1955 they had a saucer that flew 2,300 miles an hour and attained an altitude of 70,000 feet.
Yeah, I think I have pictures of military going back to the mid-1940s, and that's about as early as I've gotten. There have been some claims that they've done work with it before. There was in the 1930s. There were a pair of scientists. Their names were Biefeld and Brown, who worked on an electromagnetic device that was contained within a saucer configuration. And they only made a model, but they were able to make this saucer fly around a maypole, and it was covered by some newspapers of the period.
Uh-huh.
And then in fact, their work ended up in the hands of the Nazis before World War II. I don't know how this came about, but the Pentagon has shown an interest in this form of propulsion. In the 1950s, they took Townsend Brown, one of the original scientists who worked on this design, and he continued to work on it throughout the early 1950s until his death, which was circa 1980. So they had him intensively involved in this form of propulsion, and there's a company down in San Diego that has been experimenting. They're called Scientific Applications International. That's SAIC for short. And they've done a series of experiments on electromagnetics, and various other military outlets have as well. So they're working on very advanced designs. I explained some of the original designs and how they operated. Well, they're getting into some heavy-duty things, and I think if you go back and look at the progression of photographs, starting from the Olympus sighting, there's for instance, this was the original sighting, the first one in 1947. There was a crash involved. There were some pictures drawn, and one of the witnesses drew a wing on the back of this thing, and I have a research friend who tracked down the wing to a company called Horten Aerospace. So it wasn't aliens flying this thing around. It was very terrestrial designers.
Yeah, and that's what's so amazing to me. The other thing, too, that you talked about last week, which kind of surprised me as well, in all the research that I've ever done, and I've done a lot, and I unfortunately didn't come to the party, if you will, to the segment of research that you've done when it comes down to the intelligence community's involvement. However, I was really surprised to hear that the government did know what Foo Fighters were.
Yeah, in fact, there were American personnel who spotted these things. One of them was actually went to work with some of the Paperclip people, and I can tell you, like I mentioned the last time I talked to you, that the people who came across this technology or had anything to do with bringing it back to the U.S. ended up in very high places in the United States government. They were rapidly promoted.
Very interesting.
And now the Nazis themselves, of course, the NASA scientists are well known, the Paperclip scientists, and they're actually honored in the United States. And many of these scientists were involved in atrocities in Nazi Germany. One of them was one of the most prominent, had his photograph in a prominent place at Ohio University. His name was Hubertus Struckhold. You may remember an X-Files episode where Mulder follows this Nazi agent to a barn, which gives access to an underground tunnel full of files on American citizens. And on the side of the barn it says Struckhold Mining, which was, I just about fell out of my chair.
I would imagine.
Hubertus Strughold is known as the father of American space medicine, and he worked at Dachau and did experiments on prisoners, including torture and death.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing.
Well, that's the caliber of scientists who've contributed to our space program. So.
Now, before we go to break, I want to ask you, why do you, what is your basic premise or your basic belief? Why do we have such a prevalent, I guess, a belief in the culture about aliens when there's a good possibility that some of this could, that we're talking about tonight, could explain a lot of the weirdness that has been plaguing us for 40, 50 years?
Well, for one thing, I defy you to sit down in front of a television for 5 hours and go through the channels and not come across the word alien.
Absolutely. It's permeated the entire culture.
Yeah. And supposedly it's top secret, but I mean, how many top secret activities do you see on television every time you turn the thing on?
Yeah. Los Angeles is my guest tonight, Alex Constantine. Alex, I wonder, several years ago, there was a publication that came out as a reference text. It was the FEMA training manual. And in that training manual, there was a section in there about UFOs, which a lot of people found to be really peculiar. You remember that?
Well, I find everything coming out of the Pentagon to be peculiar.
Well, anyway, the thing is that they highlighted as I recall, a 1942 air raid over Los Angeles, where there were several blips of something detected on radar, but they were never able to see them.
Yeah, I remember seeing a photograph from the LA Times. It was on the front
right.
page.
Yes. I'm wondering how much of this that we're talking about has to do with that.
Well, I think they've been intensively involved with these things for a long time. Like I said, since the 1930s. The Pentagon really had no intense interest in the UFO design until the early 50s, and then it just jumped and started pouring money into it. So I think what happened is that you had some preliminary work on the prototypes that were developed and shown to the Pentagon, and it took maybe 4 or 5 years before the brass realized that these things actually had some potential.
Where did they? Who was the first ones to design the circular airframe?
Excuse me? The circular...
Yeah, who were the first ones to design the disc? Was it the Nazis, or did someone...
I mentioned in 1930, it was like circa 1933 or so, there was some work with that configuration, but the British took the original Foo Fighter and came up with the saucer design, and then they gave it to us. Now,
when you say they gave it to us, who would have had control of that? Would it have been the intelligence community, or what part of the government?
Yeah, well, you had this merging of wealthy financial interests and the national security elite, and melding into the CIA. This occurred in 1947. And that's sort of the center of activity. I look at the CIA as sort of a branch of the Pentagon. I know that they're kept distinct in most people's minds.
Right.
So basically their purposes are the same. And the intelligence community within the Pentagon coordinates with the CIA. They have set up a branch within the FBI that's another division of this underground security elite, and that's Division 5. And that was one of the 5 fronts for the Kennedy assassination, as a matter of fact.
As I recall, the Torbett document talks about Division 5.
Yes, it does. And actually, this division has worked up some mind control technology of their own. And there are familiar figures in the history of UFOs, including Bannister and Clay Shaw, Guy Bannister and Clay Shaw. And they go back to the Paperclip and Operation Lusty, which was another operation to bring the technology to the United States. They were involved in this gathering and also involved in the Kennedy assassination, according to many sources.
Now, let's go back to Nazi Germany.
All right.
For a second here, and let's talk about, they were working on, what they were working on. They were basically performing heinous experiments upon human beings, and they were developing mind control technology specifically for the purpose of what?
Well, they got involved in some crude forms of mind control in the concentration camps, and I think it really did. In the United States, it was fairly crude for a decade throughout the 1950s, but they had some real successes in the early 60s, and things taken off ever since. If you remember, in the about 1977, 78, Jimmy Carter fired about 800 CIA personnel.
Right.
And they went out and set up their own proprietaries, some of these people. Some of them went into business for themselves. But these people were let go because the concentration at this time is in mind control from that point on. And that's what you're hearing from the abductees. What they're describing is exactly the same thing that subjects of electronic mind control have talked about. Simulated telepathic communication. I mean, you've read your Whitley Strieber.
Right.
And I believe in his first book he doesn't talk so much about aliens. He doesn't know who he's communicating with. And I think he had some sense in the beginning that he was communicating with the intelligence community.
Well, I remember that in his book he talks about being taken to what he describes as some kind of a camp.
Yeah.
Where he sees aliens and also military personnel.
Yeah, a lot of these aliens are described, and there are some people who will swear that they're the result of genetic experimentation. And I would say that's a plausible theory, but I think that there are other abductees who've been exposed to virtual reality episodes and hypnosis, and they don't have an accurate recall of exactly what happened to them. And some of the so-called aliens that they're seeing are actually virtual reality or hypnosis,
now,
or the combination.
With that in mind, what is the definition of psychotronics?
Psychotronics, well, that's very simply electronic devices that are on the brain's frequencies.
Now, these are capable of doing what to people?
Well, there's friendly psychotronics, like the Hemisync, that is supposed to improve creativity and other mind functions. And then you have the military use of psychotronics, and of course the Pentagon is involved in the business of death and torture and so forth. And those devices are being tested out at the present time. In fact, I just pulled up an article from a military journal today that talks about this. That this is the wave of the future. The Pentagon recognizes this. They have a heavy public relations push on to sell it to the public as non-lethal weapons. So the mind control technology is buried in the non-lethal weapon technology, which includes everything from beam weapons to that spray goo you read about in Time and Newsweek.
Right. So essentially what's going on here, and this is kind of the way it looks like it shapes up when you start doing the research and you start checking this stuff out,
yep.
We're seeing technology that has been developed behind the veil of the black budget, if you will.
Yes.
That has been designed basically to control or subdue masses of people. We're seeing that some of this technology now coming through into the civilian sector.
Yes, it is.
All of the police departments and things like that.
In fact, they're very interested in the mind control technology. They're really gearing up for that.
What are they trying to do? Where are they going with this?
Well, they have, they have their uses for it. There's a device that's capable of looking through clothing, for instance, as one non-lethal device, and it can find a gun you might have on your person, or a knife, or drugs, or so all the police have to do is drive up and down the street and check out what you have in your pocket.
Right.
I mean, they have all sorts of uses for it. They have surveillance possibilities. They can subdue criminals with it. If they can even kill. I mean, there was I believe the Zapping of America by Paul Brodeur. He talks about the military use of a pulse, a microwave pulse, and it's very simple. All you have to do is match the pulse to the human heartbeat, and the human will keel over.
Really?
Yeah, it stops the heart.
Interesting.
So you can, from the very simplest applications up to lethal. And there's nothing non-lethal about these things. All you have to do is turn up the amplitude.
That's kind of like doublespeak, like George Orwell talks about. We were talking about electromagnetic weapons with Alex Constantine. Alex, let's go back to that and finish that up there.
All right. There was an organization called the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA.
Right.
Since shortened to Advanced Research Projects Agency, and of course they're famous for giving us the internet. Well, they had an integral role in developing these things, and there was a doctor. In fact, he was a fascist. His name was Dr. Jose Delgado at UCLA, who had done work on placing implants in the brains of children, who without their consent or knowledge,
right,
sort of captive. Well, he wrote about these things because he he had some first-hand knowledge of them. His financing came from the CIA and the Navy, and he considered these things, quote, more dangerous than atomic destruction. He says, with knowledge of the brain, quote, we may transform, we may shape, direct, robotize man. I think the great danger of the future is that we will have robotomized human beings who are not aware they've been robotized.
Well, that was back in the 70s, I think, wasn't it?
This was actually the 60s.
Late 60s?
Yeah. The ARPA geared up for the development of these things in 1965 after they discovered that the American embassy in Moscow was being beamed. And that was a warning to the Pentagon to not get any ideas about developing these things.
Right. Now, let's talk about this, the implant, the brain thing.
Yeah.
We have a lot of people today that tell the stories about what they perceive, and I'll be the first to say that I do not, downplay these people, because these people, in my opinion, are genuinely sincere in their belief that something extra.
Absolutely sincere.
Yeah, and the thing is, how does something like this work with that? I mean, if this can explain what is going on with the abduction phenomena, how are they doing this to people, and how are they selecting them?
Well, this coincided with the development of electromagnetic weapons in the 1960s. There were doctors, basically at UCLA, but other places as well, who had developed these implants that, and in fact, they were extremely dangerous back in the 1960s. There were subjects who were paralyzed for life because doctors had opened up their heads and placed implants in their brains and tried to control their behavior. So there are casualties of this experimentation who are swept under the rug.
Okay.
Now, this is classified stuff. I can't tell you exactly how it works, although I have my ideas about it.
Right.
And as far as the implants, there are CIA doctors out there who are claiming that they're pulling alien implants out of people's bodies. So I would say check out, if you suspect that you have one, check the doctors out very carefully, because they abscond with the implants, and you'll never see the things again. And of course,
there's no way to prove anything other than the fact that somebody says they had one. If the actual device is gone, it's gone.
Exactly. There were a couple doctors here. One was directly associated with the CIA. His name is Daryl Sims, and he worked with a Dr. Weir, and they pulled implants out of 100 people, and these implants just disappeared, and they replaced them with just pieces of comb and crystal and that sort of thing. And they don't work that way. These things are transmitters and receivers. They work on a radio frequency that's very low, very long frequency length. And that's the brain's frequency. And once you isolate it and learn how to transmit to it, you can simulate telepathy.
How have we been so blind or duped by all this? This stuff is incredible. Knowing that they have the capability of, reading your books and stuff, knowing they have the capability of actually sending a message to your head,
yeah,
to where you can't distinguish, your thoughts from some voice. People would know the difference, but, some of this sounds so incredible.
Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. There are victims who have thoughts placed in their heads, and they can't differentiate. And then there are people who know that what's going on is a dialogue, and that it's not coming from them, it's coming from some remote source.
Do you have any feel for how certain people are selected for the so-called abduction experience?
Yes, I do. I've talked to maybe hundreds of victims, and I have found patterns, and one of them is that they will use as a victim somebody who has crossed the national security elite in some way. That is, just to give you an example, there was a scientist at Stanford Research Institute who didn't like the Vietnam War, and he wrote a book about it. And then 20 years down the line, one of his children was chosen as a victim of experimentation. So they'll come along and either use the culprit, the quote, guilty party, or they'll go after the culprit's child. And that's fairly common. They'll punish the parent by working over the child. Are there any other
prerequisites to be found?
Yeah, there are. Volunteering, for instance, joining a self-improvement group that happens to be a front for mind control activity. If you, let's say, volunteer, let's say you go to the Stanford Research Institute and volunteer for remote viewing experiment.
You just might have an alien experience.
Chances are you'll be doing remote viewing all right, but it's exactly the phrasing they use. It's techno-remote viewing. It's technologically based.
But they're actually doing experimentation on these people.
Yes. You find these people just sort of, claiming they've done these amazing things. Well, yeah, they have done some amazing things. And I've seen television programs where they're 100% accurate. They're actually doing remote viewing, but it's not a natural ability. It's the testing of advanced emerging technology.
This is incredible. You say it's emerging advanced technology.
Yes.
What is this stuff based on? Like computers? What's the deal?
Well, computers are very much a part of it now. You may remember in the 1950s, artificial intelligence was glimpsed as a possibility, and then by the mid-60s, people just stopped talking about it. And that's because some of the best scientists in that field were recruited.
Right.
And artificial intelligence now is combined with supercomputers, and these things can access, hundreds of victims at the same time and carry on individual, discrete communications with each one of these people.
This is absolutely incredible. And, let's take a look back here. For example, I know a little bit about the history of the UFO thing.
Right.
When you're talking about recruiting these fine minds, yes. Von Neumann comes to mind when you're talking about artificial intelligence.
All right.
One of those, he was one of those characters that was recruited, the MJ-12 fiasco.
Okay.
He supposedly was one of those gentlemen that were recruited to look at this stuff that allegedly came out of Roswell and other so-called crash stories.
Good point. Good point.
The other thing, too, is when you look at some of these cases, the famous cases, for example, Betty and Barney Hill,
yes,
there were certain inconsistencies and things that, in my research, and I've talked to Betty Hill privately. She's a very interesting lady.
Well, let's explain the inconsistencies and the problems here.
Okay, let's do it. Go ahead. You start off, and I've got a couple, too, I want to bring up.
Okay, fine. Back in 1960, the CIA, through its own Human Ecology Fund, developed a device called EDOM. This is electronic dissolution of memory, and this device could wipe out your memory entirely. In fact, they went too far with some people and wiped out their mind, just wiped them blank. But they were able to, through experimentation, to wipe out short-term memories. And that's why the Hill case comes along, because once they were able to wipe out your short-term memories, they could do anything to these people that they want.
They can replace it with other things.
Sure, and the inconsistencies are natural. They come with hypnosis and electronic assault on the brain.
Okay, Alex, hold that right there. We got to go to another break. We had such an overwhelming response. We wanted to get back to this subject we've been talking about. And we don't have much time left in this first hour, Alex, and you're going to carry over with us into the second hour. But I want to kind of pick up real quick where we left off about the inconsistencies with the Betty and Barney Hill case.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people who have studied that particular abduction case, but, one of the things I found very interesting was the two characters that contacted the Hills shortly after they had written their letter to Donald Kehoe. One of his name was C.D. Jackson.
C.D. Jackson.
And you have a guy in your book, in your research, that pops up named C.D. Jackson. Can you give us kind of like about a 1-minute little rundown on who this guy was?
Yeah, excuse me for laughing, but this is such a scam that they pulled.
Yeah.
C.D. Jackson was a mind control operative. He's one of the original Mockingbirds. He's from the Mockingbird program conceived by Alan Dulles in 1947, and the idea of Mockingbird was mass mind control through the media. C.D. Jackson was one of the early Mockingbirds. Another one was Richard Mellon's case, incidentally.
Uh-huh.
He's come up in the news as the leader of the right-wing conspiracy against Clinton. And when you think about it, these mind control personnel are in the publishing business, and that's a little scary.
Yeah, that's the thing. Okay, we're out of time.
Right.
We'll be joining you in the second hour locally, and for the national side, I want to thank you for being on the program with us tonight.